trained journalist, history expert, and combat photographer in Central America, Cork has 3 decades of treasure hunting experience that began when he was 18.
After Captain Kidd's treasure on an island off the west coast of Vietnam, it was an illegal covert operation. It was one of the darkest moments of my life.
The Vietnamese admitted they had arrested Knight and Graham for violating the territory of the Socialist Republic of Vietnam, and they were in prison. But now, the Vietnamese played pirate, demanding a ransom of $10,000 per man. But neither the US nor the British government would pay a penny.
The British government would not pay a ransom, would they? They don't pay official ransoms. They always make a thing of, we don't pay, otherwise it just happens again.
I was held for 11 months, and 7 of those I was in solitary confinement.
By the 17th of May 1984, Fred Graham was free and returned to America, 40 pounds lighter than when he had left home on his adventures. In the years that followed, Fred Graham's thirst for adventure remained unquenched. He succeeded in working as a photojournalist, and also, ironically, for the CIA during the US war in El Salvador. Now, he is an author of political thrillers.
And that was Against All Odds by Phil Collins, released the week of May 19th, 1984. That was also my day of being released. Not the day, but actually the week. I was released May 17th, 1984 from Vietnam. And looking at how repressive communist countries can be and how things are going right now in the world, it's wise to look at what's happening in Venezuela. Why Venezuela? Let me take you back. Let me take you back all the way to what happened after I got back from Vietnam, which is I went to Central America and participated in that war from 1985 until 1990. What was happening? Well, in the end, we won the war. The Soviet Union fell in December of 1991. And after that, something very interesting happened. What happened was that Fidel Castro, who realized that he could not bring communism to the Americas and have it take militarily, restructured, he and his brother Raul restructured their strategy and started taking the money, the great wealth that they had, and also the investment of various entities that we'll be talking in various episodes in the future about, to go further than, quote, the deep state, even further than the New World Order. It goes into the globalists, the global elites, who they are, what they do, how do they work together, how do they work against each other. They're not all peachy keen with each other. But in regards to what happened in Latin America and is happening in Latin America, let's take a look at Venezuela. So in what year was it that our friend Hugo, 1997, Hugo Chavez, he brought in the United Socialist Party of Venezuela. You know, I always have a situation where I just pay attention that when I see the colors red, white, or red and gold, and it's got a star, or it's got a hammer and sickle, I pay attention. So basically, Hugo Chavez brought in the Communist Party to Venezuela, and he did so with the aid of Fidel Castro. And having learned that militarily they couldn't achieve victory in Latin America, they began buying the campaigns. And once they realized that they could succeed in Venezuela, they began going after other countries. So they actually went to Nicaragua and bankrolled Daniel Ortega. They went into El Salvador. where we had had a bloody war against the communists and enable that party, it now was a party to, when previously it was a terrorist organization, to win in campaign. And they basically did the same thing that just about every corrupt party does in Latin America, is they just stole from the people. And they did it in Brazil, succeeded in Brazil with Lula. And now Lula's back in again. But what's really interesting is how South America is actually a training ground for the globalist elites in order to play at the game of power. And understanding how to modify countries by buying certain representatives in order to achieve the kind of control in the actions that they want within a government. So you see you saw what happened in Brazil, where they've assisted the communists. I will later talk about, and it's something really important to understand, why is it that the wealthy elite, I mean, when I talk about wealthy elite, I'm talking about the most powerful elite, not of a country, but of the world, and how these people, you would think they would be totally against communism, but they're not against communism. They actually are for communism. But just to give you a quick reason of why, it's because there's no other government system that can enable a small group of people, even to the point of one person, have that amount of control. Even the monarchies throughout history have never reached that type of control. And you would think, well, you could do that with a monarchy if you've got an empire that, let's say, the British Empire previously, or the Spanish Empire, or the French empires, whether they had achieved that type of a control. But you can't do it that way because there's a national identity of the other country, for instance, Spain or England or France. And it's interesting, the United States has been able to circumvent that, but just because of the multinationality of the United States, that our creation of an empire, really beginning after World War II, was achieved because of a global understanding that surmounted the idea of separation of nationalism within countries, right? But going back to Central and South America is the idea that we as Americans and North Americans are looking at South America. It's important to understand that South America is a training ground for strategies and types of campaigns that are being used in the United States. Look at what's happening right now in the protests in Venezuela. So Maduro is going after Gonzalez, who the Venezuelan people feel that Gonzalez had actually won. This brings us back to what happened in the United States with those who had felt that not Biden had won, but that Trump had won in the previous election. And that's going to bring up questions about if they were able to steal the election previously, if the communists were able to take over and continue their regime under Biden, which started with Obama, why would anybody think that an election this time would be respected? And that's going to bring up questions about what people have been talking about, which is civil war. And the question of who's going to initiate that civil war. And if we look at Venezuela right now, it's very interesting because I would have thought that Gonzalez would have been asking the Venezuelan people to stand up and take back what had been stolen. But the first one out of the gate was actually Maduro, who was calling for, as I was listening and watching on Spanish language TV, Guerra Civil. So it was actually Maduro who was actually calling up a civil war in the country. And he was doing this at the same time he had already brought in troops from Cuba. There were already Cuban troops in Venezuela. They've been there. And then also bringing in Bolivian troops. Remember, these are two nations that are either socialist or flat out communist. And more you're going to start seeing that socialist nations, there's a the thin line between socialism and communism is just disappearing, to the point that the violence, like the Pol Pot, the Maoist type of Marxism, of communism, is going to be rampant throughout these countries that are taken over by the communists. And what they'll do is they accuse the others of what they're about to do. Just in the same way that the Communist Party, aka the Democrat Party of the United States, was always accusing Trump and the Republicans of doing things that in actuality the Democrat Party was doing. That's a very old tactic that the communists used. They've used it for decades, going all the way back to Lenin, going all the way back to Marx, Karl Marx himself, which is to accuse others of what they themselves want to do or are doing, even to the point that you'd have Marx saying, oh, he's against religion and doesn't want any religion, and that communism will be Marxism will be totally free of a belief in God and religion, and yet Marx was actually just trying to make himself God. That's the mentality of how this plays out. Now, as North Americans, as we look down at what's happening in Venezuela, we're seeing the tactics that have been partly used in this country. And it's going to be really important to watch what happens in Venezuela. And I find it ironic that the regime that we have in power right now in the United States, and I'll be talking about how it's actually been a continuous regime, even during Trump, because Trump didn't have a full administration, because his administration was totally infiltrated by the people that were placed by Obama. Like you had General Milli Vanilli, who was a total traitor. He's a traitor to his country. He's a traitor to the American people. Whenever you have a politician, and when you become a flag officer, you are a politician. If you're willing to actually communicate and you call an officer, the command of a foreign country, and a country that actually has traditionally been an enemy of the United States, i.e. China, and you tell them that you will call them in case your president initiates a nuclear attack against that country, you are actually aiding the enemy when you do something like that. How Milli Vanilli is not in prison right now on charges of treason is mind-blowing. But if you look at the idea that the administration never left, and think about this, why is it that every president before, and probably, hopefully, it'll be healthy again, every president after all this is over will go through their terms, and then they will go. They retire and they leave Washington. The only president to never leave Washington in the whole history of the United States is Obama, when he created a shadow government. And so that government was run. That's how he was able to communicate and run they were able to run their operations under the Trump administration, which I was floored. Bannon, from what I had heard, the reason there was that rift between Steve Bannon and President Trump was that Bannon had told him he understood how Machiavellian Washington is, and that he had to clean house. It did not matter the merits or the skill or the knowledge and wisdom of the candidate. That person had to be gone because they were of the prior administration, because of the importance of loyalty And loyalty under the administration is utmost importance, along with skill and ability, which is interesting because most of the people who are in Washington now have no ability. And you look at them and you wonder, why are they there? They're there because they're easily manipulated, either out of greed or out of fear that somebody will find out what they've been up to. Kind of like along the lines of the Epstein files. We're still waiting for it. So when people say that America is becoming a third world country, we are a third world country. And the key, though, is to watch out and look and review of what other third world countries are doing and how things are playing out in those countries. And right now we have Venezuela. And you're watching the fighting and the protests. And we've had how many illegals? They say 20 million, 22 million illegal immigrants have come into this country. As far as I'm concerned, at least 50% of them are agents, especially from China. So if they're agents and they're well-trained, and most of them are of male military age, they're operators. The question is, when do those operators actually get initiated? When do they get called into play? And if we watched Venezuela, we're watching all these Cubans being called into play. We're watching these Cubans attacking Venezuelans. And remember, if you're not of a country, it's easier for you to be told something to do that might be atrocious for you to do in your own country. This is one of the playouts that they were talking about, the idea that during the Obama administration, if there was going to be, quote, a civil war, what they were going to start doing is they were going to start taking sheriffs from one area, one county, and shifting them over to another county, even though sheriffs are put in office based on elections, right? So they have a closer tie, and there's a lot of respect in the sheriff's community for the Constitution. Because remember, that we are only a country as long as we are defined and follow the U.S. Constitution, which we have been repeatedly pulling away from for mind-blowing reasons that don't equate with what's being lost. Looking at Venezuela, we see that outside operators had been brought into the country, and we're talking in the 200,000s. So, relatively speaking, if you look at what we've got in our country, and you look at what they had brought in, and they brought them in, so the administration brought them in, just in the same way that this present administration has brought them in. If you have civil unrest, and if you have civil unrest within this country because of rightful disagreement of the citizens against theft of an election, do you think they wouldn't use those foreign operators to quell the protests? And that's even a question of how many people will actually stand up and take back the country, because we do have so much division in this country. Probably the only thing that's keeping us going is like those things on my wall behind me. We have a Second Amendment. But you notice that they're constantly trying to take away your Second Amendment, our Second Amendment. There's a reason that the Second Amendment follows the First Amendment. The stupidest thing the Venezuelans do, and they are crying about it now, is for safety, they relinquish their right to arm themselves. And why? For safety. Which takes you back to Benjamin Franklin saying, those who would be willing to trade their liberty for a little bit of safety are worthy of neither safety nor liberty. So beware of what you think is a quick fix, because quick fixes are never quick, and they're most often very expensive. We're being called, hopefully, to understand what civics is in this country, because we've fallen so far away from civics. And this is just like in third world countries. If you talk to people in Latin America, 9 times out of 10, they're just so focused on keeping their family fed, keeping a roof over their head. And when it comes to decisions of politics, well, they think about that as a third part. There isn't that understanding of civics and how the government is based on the people. It's not based on the administration. They're not supposed to be our leaders. They're supposed to be our administrators. That's why it's called an administration, not a dictatorship, not a monarchy. It's an administration. They're supposed to administer what we tell them to do. We're the leaders of the United States. The people who work in D.C. are the administrators. They're managers. Even the president is a manager. He's a figurehead, but he's not a leader. The leader of the United States is the American people. The key, though, is for the American people to understand and recognize that. Because it's lost in other countries. In my mother's country of Ecuador, I don't know if they'll ever find that back again. Venezuela, it's a question whether Gonzalez will actually take power. And then the question is, will the people unite around with him and make it, if they want a democracy or they want a republic? In the United States, we have a republic. And when more people understand the difference between a republic as compared to a democracy, that means that the American people are understanding civics. So look at what's happening in Venezuela. Pay attention to what's happening in Venezuela. As you see what's happening in Venezuela, watch how Maduro uses the language in order to distract people away from the real core of the matter, which is he's retaining power, he's using military force, and he's using foreign operators in order to implement that force. And he's a continuation of a political party, of a government that was basically put in place by Fidel Castro through Hugo Chavez. In the same way it was put in place in Venezuela with Lula and with Daniel Ortega, and then with the FMLN back in El Salvador, and even Correa in Ecuador. So all these countries are dealing with the backlash of communism being put in the country. And in the next episode, I will be talking with you about how and when communism took power in the United States. Everything that we were warned about by Joseph McCarthy, Senator Joe McCarthy, who was vilified, have come to play. And even the statements from Alexander Solzhenitsyn, when he came to the United States and he did a talk, as I recall, was it Yale or Harvard? I'll have it finalized by the time I get back. I'll have the full research for you. And I'll read to you what he said. Basically, he warned us to not become like the USSR. And that Khrushchev had actually, quote, jokingly, partly, but I don't think jokingly that much, was he told Eisenhower that communism would take over the United States, and would take it over through the young, who would bring it up, and it would be totally infiltrated through the United States. And it's interesting that communism has taken over the United States when it's actually failed and collapsed in the USSR. Remember, communism is separate. I like to describe it this way, especially during the GWAT. Islam is a political front. Communism is a religion. And when you have a religion, the ability for it to be like a whack-a-mole from country to country to country is incredible. And if you want to know what it's personally like to go through communism and what it's like to be in prison in a communist country, get a copy of my 2004 international bestseller, The Bamboo Chest. It's in its second edition now. It's been for a while. Get a copy of that. It's over at Amazon. I think you'll enjoy it. It's a good read. It's a father-son story. But it also tells you about what could happen if they finalize their plans in the United States. And if you want to know how they're doing it, read on the media. That's my other story. That's what it was like being on Treasure Quest, Snake Island. So You Want to Be a Reality TV Star by Cork Graham. That's also in Amazon. And this one's a good one because it talks about my combat experience a little bit and how that relates to media. Because boy, oh boy, every time I look at the news, I'm telling you, like today, I'm going to be going out, replanting some more blueberries. I'll be planting some pow and figs. We got some figs and we got some mulberry. And they're going to go in the high tunnel. And so they'll be in the high tunnel growing for about 2 or 3 years, and then they'll be replanted outside, just like I did with the blueberries. And next year I'll be doing with the apple trees and the cherry trees. But as I'm looking at Venezuela, I can tell you is that I'm so happy that we live in the country and we're able to grow food. Because it's all intertwined together. This is the collapse. What you're seeing, this is a global effect. You're seeing the hot points right now in Venezuela, Ukraine. You're seeing all these hot points right now, but that's a civilization that is faltering, and it's getting ready to collapse. The same exact thing happened in Rome. This is exactly what happened in Rome. With the United States, it's like Rome bringing in all the barbarians, and then soon the barbarians just basically just leveled and took everything. And in the same way, it's happening in the United States on small. You see little sparks. And it'll get to the point where law enforcement and then even the military won't be able to control it. And it'll just take over. And everything will be taken. And then these people who are here, who were brought in to destroy the country, and you got to ask yourself, if there's no unifying aspect other than as they're being processed, they're being programmed to vote Democrat as they cross the line. I mean, this is documented stuff. I mean, I'm not just pulling it out of my head. I mean, I've seen the videos, I've seen the interviews down on the border, and even in Mexico, and even in Panama. You know, my friend Michael Yon, he was talking to these people, and they're telling them as they give them the cash to carry them up here to the border of the United States. And now they're coming in from Canada because it's a lot easier. If you can get to Canada, it's a lot easier to come into the United States from like New York and up in that area. This is initiated invasion by the very administration that is supposed to be checked. There are things that are defined in the Constitution that are very clear. And it's wild that the administration is doing everything but that. You're not supposed to be required, you're not supposed to be provided a certain amount of income. You're not supposed to be provided social services. Under the Constitution, the government is only supposed to do a few things. And that's why we even have a standing military. But the standing military is actually supposed to be very small, just like the government itself, or the Senate, the administration. And the reason is because it's the people who define the country. We've gotten so far away from who we are as Americans that we basically become like another European nation. Except maybe Switzerland. And even Switzerland has been giving everything away because the globalists have been so good of infiltrating into every administration around the world, getting them to move away from the very doctrines, from the very constitutions that were created in order to protect the citizens from what's happening, which is the country being taken over by an ever-increasing government. So pay attention to what's happening in Venezuela. Watch how they play the demonstrations. Watch how they play the media and use the media locally, domestically, in order to control the people in the same way that's being done here. And it's interesting. I just find it, I'm thinking about it. It's very interesting that suddenly our administration is unhappy with with what's happening with Maduro. Like it's kind of like a call out. Say, oh well, you can't be doing that because that's it's very undemocratic. And yet the things that are being done in the United States by the same administration is mind blowing, because it's neither democratic nor a respect of the Constitution. And it's kind of sad right now because we're getting into a situation about something that I learned very heavily in these other countries that I was in war. And that is in contrast to how our country started, which is it was just taxation without representation. We've had taxation without representation since the creation of Social Security and the creation of the Federal Reserve, which then also led into the taxation under the IRS. That's taxation without representation. And we've had that for how long? And you contrast that with what created this country, which is colonials, British citizens were unhappy with the fact that we had no representation in Parliament whatsoever. And it wasn't even made clear to Benjamin Franklin until he went to Parliament and stood in front of Parliament, and they laughed at him. And we'll have a talk about that because it's interesting that we see these people in politics. And I want to talk about Trump because I've heard stories about Trump that are very, very interesting about how why did he run in the first place? And it revolves around the Clintons and how he didn't get an invitation to Bill and the witch's daughter's wedding, which is an insult. And it's interesting because if you look at it historically, Benjamin Franklin didn't want to have separation from England until he was treated rudely by Parliament. And he came back and says, we're on. And that was it. So think about those things. It's something so monumental and far-reaching could start with something emotional and just a personal slight. And look at what's happening in Venezuela, which is South America. And South Americans, as you know, Latinos, yeah, we get very emotional about things if you disrespect us. So check it out. On that note, I'm going to close. We'll be talking about how the commies took over D.C. and how easy it was. And it was so easy because the ground had been prepared for the previous, 30 years? Through the media, through the politicians themselves. God, I think about Tipper. God, who was the guy who was the Speaker of the House when I was in Central America? That guy was a toad. Yeah. Yeah, he's long dead now, but hey, c'est la vie. So on that note, stay safe, watch your six. If you're watching on YouTube, please like, subscribe, and share. If you're listening on Spotify, iHeartRadio, and Apple Podcast, please share with your friends. We got more coming. We're getting you ready because when that zombie apocalypse hits, I want to make sure that if you're not in the country, at least you've got a fighting chance. So on that note, good luck. Talk to you later.